All right, so I think we're ready to go now, and you will recognize the cast of characters from our previous conversations about the question of whether or not the United States is entering a constitutional crisis. I had been talking about that for a couple of weeks, and then last week I interrupted the flow of the conversation, the series of topics we were covering with regards to constitutional crises, because of what happened between Vladimir Zelensky, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance in the Oval Office on Friday, the 28th of February. We will come back to that at the close of this month and look a little bit more, maybe have a little bit more information as well about what's happening in the world of international relations and the way in which the pivot of the Trump administration away from our traditional allies and in the direction of autocracy is influencing international relations. So we will return to that topic at length, but first I want to try to close out the discussion on constitutional crises, and I'd like to do that with you this week and next week by looking at the question of whether or not a constitutional crisis can be resolved, and if so, how. And this builds on the idea that the Constitution, right, in ways that we've talked about extensively at this point, neither interprets nor administers itself. It depends upon officials in the federal government and in each of the three main branches of the federal government, but also on people within political parties in position of leadership there, people within firms and other powerful social organizations, and ordinary citizens, all valuing and adhering to some shared constitutional principles, values, and norms. And so, in that sense, constitutional order is both fragile and messy. It resides not simply in institutions, but in the way in which those institutions are animated by the people who play critical roles in those institutions, and then ultimately by the broader political and civic culture of the society that has that constitutional structure. And then messy because, frankly, we evolve. Our understandings change over time. The understandings of political elites, of partisan elites, of social elites, and of ordinary persons change. And they change in part due to the intrinsic dynamics of beliefs, right? Over time, we come to believe that sexism is wrong, that racism is wrong. We begin to have a better understanding of the environment and ecosystems and climate change. And so that leads us to value things differently. But they also occur, these changes in the underlying culture that supports different understandings of the Constitution, that changes as well due to changes in technology, changes in demographics, changes in the distribution of income and wealth. And so there is a intrinsic messiness to this. And I'm not going to claim to eliminate that messiness for you. Part of my point is to focus on it and to suggest that the very project of sustaining constitutional democracy over time is a collective accomplishment. It is a fragile accomplishment, and it requires a certain level of engagement or even vigilance on the part of the population. And that part of the reason we are perhaps edging in the direction of constitutional crisis in the United States under Donald Trump's second term as president is not only because Donald Trump is eager to test the bounds of presidential power and to fundamentally revise the limits, the checks, the balances, the norms that have constrained presidents' exercises of power in the previous 80 years of I want to say, implicit and perhaps not adequate, but at least sufficient constitutional consensus to prevent this kind of abuse of power. So Donald Trump in ways that I'll argue today, in keeping with what we've talked about before, I believe is uh, not someone who respects the prevailing or perhaps the receding, the declining constitutional order, and he wants to overturn it because he sees an opportunity to increase his power by so doing. But having said that, I think if Donald Trump were doing this in an environment in which the constitutional consensus, in which our shared understanding of the value and norms that sustain the Constitution were stronger, then he would be having less success and his prospects for success would be lesser. I think, in a sense, the understanding of Trump's first term in office should include the idea that the constitutional consensus was stronger in 2017, 2018, 2019 than it is in 2025. And so the idea that he did get impeached twice for abuse of power in his first term, never convicted, but nevertheless, those are stains on his record that prevented his administration from focusing all of its resources on the exercise of power. They had to play defense instead of playing offense. I don't see that happening, right? I mean, we'll have to see how crass, how brash Trump is in his abuse of power. Maybe he will cross some line that even partisan Republicans decide they have to condemn him on the basis of, but it certainly doesn't seem like we're in that place anymore. Tom Tillis's quote, right? I wouldn't bellyache over a little obviously unconstitutional action from the president, I think is indicative of the fact that in the scheme of values of many Americans, the elites whose job it is, in a sense, to uphold the constitutional order, they take an oath to do that, but also ordinary people. The Constitution has receded in significance, and so there is an opportunity for Donald Trump to be a more powerful, a less restrained, a less checked and balanced president than presidents have been for a very long time. And Donald Trump, I think, discerns that, he senses that, and he is going to do his best to maximize his power by tearing down constraints on it. And then the question is, what can we do, right? How can we respond? What avenues are available to us? It's not just that he's the president of the United States, it's that he's using power in a deeply ruthless way. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but to chill, to silence, to intimidate his opponents, to try to prevent there from being any resistance or any meaningful resistance. And of course, his party has control over both houses of Congress and, in certain degrees, at least the upper echelons of the federal bench. And so there don't appear to be the kinds of restraints that we've relied on in the past. And so the focus for this and next week will be on two topics that are frankly somewhat tensely related to each other. One topic will be, how can countervailing power be rebuilt? And here you may recognize a term that was often used to describe labor or unions in the 20th century, the idea of a power that counterbalanced the power of corporations or the concentrated power of the very wealthy, was to be found in labor unions. And I'm going to look a little bit at that idea. I'm going to suggest to you that in the 21st century, we need more diverse sources of countervailing power. And in particular, that in the next 4 years, we need power that countervails not only the concentrated power of the very wealthy, especially firms and corporations, but also the power of the president, the power of the dominance of one party over our federal government? How can we reconstitute some meaningful form of civic power to fight power with power, right? And so that's one topic. The second topic is um, assuming that our constitutional consensus, right, our shared understanding of the Constitution is what ultimately sustains constitutional order. And assuming that our constitutional consensus is frayed, that we live in an age of fracture, that we are cleaved as a public, we are partitioned in our understanding of the value of the Constitution, right? I think, many traditional Democrats and liberals and progressives have somewhat ambivalent feelings about the Constitution, but certainly prefer it to the naked exercise of political power unrestrained by an unrepentant president, right? But having said that, that's only, let us say, 40% of the population, a third of the population. And it appears that another third of the population has concluded that the constitutional order of the 20th century, the early 21st century, no longer works. And I think they have a point. And I think that the result is that we no longer have a functioning constitutional consensus in this country. And so we have to figure out what we might be able to do to rebuild the constitutional consensus. And that includes not only, right, trying to uh, revalue, trying to discern how to value the Constitution in a way that reaches out to those who currently disagree with us, or who are increasingly skeptical that our 18th century constitutional structure works for 21st century politics and society based on long experience. So how do we reach them? How do we attempt to rebuild consensus in a fractured society on this extremely important issue of what the value of our Constitution is? That's half the project. I think the other half of the project is figuring out how to make the Constitution work better in the 21st century. If the people who are increasingly skeptical of the value of the Constitution have a point, this constitutional structure does not appear to be producing the kinds of responsiveness, the level of democratic justice, the kind of protection and dignity that we associate with constitutional politics. Then how do we repair constitutional order for the 21st century? I hope you can see how those two topics are somewhat tensely related to each other, right? On the one hand, we need power to fight power with, right? That's not a way to build a consensus. That's a way to push back against powerful opponents. And on the other hand, we also at the same time need to reach out to people with whom we disagree sharply, and to do so from a place that doesn't simply surrender or compromise with them when we believe that they are in principle making deep mistakes, but also allows us to appeal to something we believe we share with them, some core sense of justice, some valuing of democracy, and in particular, constitutional democracy, and to try, in a sense, to ask them, do you still value these institutions that have furnished our identity and sustained our political project over the last, right? We're coming up on 250 years. So that's the questions I want to speak with you about over the next couple of classes. I will very quickly, because we interrupted last week, begin to give you the review, right? The abuse of power is the point, and here when I say the abuse of power is the point, remember, right? These are all areas where the Trump administration has been sued because it appears that the action that it's undertaking is a violation of the law, violation of separation of powers, an abuse of executive power. And some of these places, the courts have intervened to stop. Some of those initial decisions have now been appealed by the Trump administration. Sometimes the Trump administration is prevailing at the appellate level. Sometimes the finding of the earlier decision has been upheld, or at least temporarily so. And so we're in the middle of a messy legal process playing out on a whole bunch of different fronts. But my fundamental suggestion is that this is not the case that is sometimes present in an earlier president, right? Which is to say, there's an issue where the law is ambiguous and the president is going to push to see if maybe he can prevail. This is far too systematic. There are too many fronts on which the law is being disregarded. There's something deeper going on here than testing, right, the law on a single issue. This is testing the very terms of the post-World War II political settlement, which is at the constitutional level, a settlement that says Congress can restrain the executive use of power by creating administrative agencies with legal mandates populated by civil servants whose job it is to do what Congress has directed them to do, despite the fact that the president gets to appoint the head of the executive branch agency. The president does not have unitary power over that agency. The agency is also controlled by the statute that created it, enables it, directs it, funds it, which is all Congress's work. So that limits executive power, as does the post-Watergate initiatives, as do the post-Watergate initiatives that imposed various forms of oversight, watchdogs, whistleblower protections to prevent the abuse of executive power in recognition of the fact that executive power has grown substantially over the 20th and into the 21st centuries, right? And so if I've got it right, the reason to simultaneously do all of this stuff that apparently violates the law is to challenge the very basis of the law, to suggest basically that Congress never had the power to create these administrative agencies, watchdogs, whistleblower protections, oversight, protections against funds being impounded, that the whole post-war settlement can be blown up with an alternative constitutional theory, the theory of the unitary executive, and the result will be, if the Supreme Court ultimately sides with Trump on enough of these issues, a radical expansion of executive power. That seems to me to be the fundamental drama playing out in all of these court cases. Of course, none of them focuses on that big question. They focus on the minutia, but nevertheless, right, when we look at this again, right, how many executive actions he's taken, how he's outpacing every previous 20th century, 21st century president, and not just outpacing them a little, double the pace, and how many of these actions have been blocked or partially blocked or are caught up in court right now. I think we see the overall intent that is the architecture, the underlying unity of all of this action. And then we notice, right, that in addition to the fact that Donald Trump has this theory and is executing it aggressively, let us try to vastly expand executive power and upturn the previous constitutional settlement, hope that the Supreme Court sides with us in doing that ultimately. It appears that Congress is not going to check Donald Trump in any way, right? And so the idea that the entirety of his cabinet has been confirmed by the Senate, and that this is one of the most radical and, I think, objectively speaking, poorly qualified cabinets to have been appointed by a president of the United States, and that many of these people are people who the senators on the Republican Party are on record as being opposed to the views that they represent, and nevertheless they're voting for them, represents the clear fact that at this point the Republican Party really has just become the party of Donald Trump. There appears to be no willingness, no appetite in any way to check him. And so long as the Republicans continue to control the House and the Senate, I think we should expect that there won't be any congressional check on President Trump. And the one question here, right, is okay, they control both houses. Can they actually legislate, right? Their majorities are so slender, so fragile, right? And we're seeing this play out already with the budget fight. It's entirely possible that they will fail to fully enact the Trump agenda due to internal divisions, due to the fact, frankly, that they don't have the mandate they would like to represent themselves as having, as reflected in the very tenuous hold they have on Congress. And so we'll have to see on that question how well can they actually legislate. But I certainly don't think we should expect that Congress will serve as a check on Trump. The real check, if there's going to be any, will come from the courts. And then that raises a number of questions. Among them, how will the legal process be used or abused by the Trump administration? One of the issues, right, with the effort to essentially induce the mayor of New York, Mayor Eric Adams, to cooperate with the Trump deportation policy by using the legal vulnerability that he has as a result of having been indicted to induce him to cooperate, suggests that this is an administration that is going to play fast and loose with the norms surrounding the rule of law, the impartial administration of the law by the Justice Department, right? As Hagen Skoton said in his resignation letter, this is not the way we do things in the Department of Justice. And so one of the things that I think Donald Trump and his administration are trying to do is to clear out the Department of Justice, to replace the people who will have principled resistance to their much more transactional, much more power maximizing approach to administering the law. Similarly, right, the idea that they are hollowing out the watchdogs, firing everybody who's in a position, and we've seen, right, some things happening in court that have gone a little bit in the Trump direction that increases the likelihood that they may have success in removing congressional oversight, in replacing the inspectors generals and other people who are in positions of oversight authority with their own loyalists, their own lackeys. And so the idea that, again, there will be a check on the abuse of power that comes from within the administration or from within the administrative state seems increasingly narrow. I will point to a moment for just a moment to try to have a slightly broader understanding on this. We've spoken together in the past about Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt's work. And I've spoken with you about Daniel Ziblatt's work on conservative parties and how important they are in maintaining democratic stability. We've looked at Levitsky and Zablat's more recent book on tyranny of the minority and the institutions that amplify minority power in American government. They're extremely interesting, extremely productive, and in future lectures, I'll talk with you about some of the work that they're issuing right now in response to the Trump administration. But for the time being, I really want to focus on the juxtaposition of two ideas here. And the first is one that comes out in a headline. I'm sorry, it looks like it's a little bit cut off, but from a couple days ago. This version is from the Washington Post, but you could find it in many different newspapers. Trump expands retribution campaign against law firms that aided his foes, right? And in particular, what Trump is doing, what his administration are doing, is taking away, the security clearances. I'm having trouble. Why are my slides not cooperating? Give me one moment here. Sorry. They are going after the firms that they don't like, the law firms that they don't like. And in particular, right, taking away security clearances from those law firms. And given the kind of work that those firms do, that's extraordinarily debilitating. They represent people who handle classified documents. If they don't have a security clearance, they can't see the evidence that's relevant to the cases they're trying. This is essentially a no holds bar approach to the exercise of power. Find every place in the law where the president has unchecked, untrammeled, unrestricted power, and then use that to maximal advantage. I think it's one of the reasons we're seeing the tariffs being threatened so regularly is because Congress has essentially given the president unilateral power to determine when tariffs will be imposed on foreign countries. Similarly, right, the president has unilateral power to determine who has and who doesn't have security clearances. And I think the assumption on the part of Congress in giving the president that power was that he would use it only to make sure that the secrets, the intelligence, the classified information of the United States was secure. But in fact, Donald Trump is using it, his administration is using it as a cudgel to punish people they don't agree with, right? And I think it's that simple, that straightforward. And please note, right, withholding $400 million from Columbia University, beginning to go after not only law firms and universities, but the press, right, not allowing the AP to have access to the White House to do its job reporting on what's happening in the press conferences in the White House. In various ways, this administration is trying to send out the message the rules have changed. We are using power in a different way, and we don't care about the old norms, the old principles, the old values. If they get in the way of using our power, we are going to have no time for them whatsoever, right? This goes back to something we spoke about last week. And I suggest to you this is, in a sense, the key to understanding the Trump administration and Donald Trump in particular, the idea that he has, right, what Raymond Williams calls a structure of feeling, a basic root conviction that it has been foolish on the part of powerful people to relinquish their power in the name of principles, norms, or values, and that he is not going to fall into that sucker's trap. He is going to not worry about any norm that isn't written down as a law that's enforceable. We'll have to see whether he worries about what the courts say, right? It's an open question right now. But all that to say, like Levitsky and Zablat remind us, and this is the central thesis of the book that made them famous, How Democracies Die, that democracies, liberal constitutional democracies, rely on norms, principles, values, convictions. That one of the roles of political parties is to socialize potential leaders into the norms that sustain the constitutional order. Another role of a party is to vet and exclude leaders who do not actually have a sufficient understanding or allegiance to the constitutional order. They use a kind of game theoretic vocabulary to talk about this, the rules of the game, right? If you understand and are willing to play by the rules of the game, then the party might elevate you. If you're not, it's either going to try to explain to you, socialize you into adherence to those rules, or it's going to try to keep you out. And that one of the things about Donald Trump's hostile takeover of the Republican Party a decade ago, maybe that's such old news we should stop talking about it. Maybe this just is Donald Trump's Republican Party now. But the Republican Party has had a fundamental identity change in a way that makes it such that this is no longer a party that demands adherence to constitutional norms from its members. Quite to the contrary, it demands allegiance to a leader who has no respect for those norms and sees them as restricting his field of play, the area in which he can exercise the power that he has. So to quote just for a moment Levitsky and Zablat in one of the, I think, important passages of How Democracies Die, wrapping things up in the conclusion, say, writing this book has reminded us that American democracy is not as exceptional as we sometimes believe. There's nothing in our Constitution or culture to immunize us against democratic breakdowns. We have experienced political catastrophe before when regional and partisan enmities so divided the nation that it collapsed into civil war. Our constitutional system recovered, and Republican and Democratic leaders developed new norms and practices that would undergird more than a century of political stability. But that stability came at the price of racial exclusion and authoritarian single-party rule in the South. It was only after 1965 that the United States fully democratized. I'm not sure I would give us as much credit as they do in that regard, but that's a topic for another day. And paradoxically, that very process began a fundamental realignment of the American electorate that has once again left our parties deeply polarized. This polarization, deeper than at any time since the end of Reconstruction, has triggered the epidemic of norm breaking that now challenges our democracy. And I just want to point out to you, this is written, I believe, in 2017, 2018, not in 2025, right? And so this has been a long time coming, right? But the idea that democracy is sustained by norms, that parties enforce norms and select leaders who have the appropriate fidelity to the constitutional and political norms that sustain the practice of democracy, that since the Civil Rights Revolution, the Republican Party has been drifting in the direction of no longer adhering to those norms, and that Donald Trump represents the coup de grace, the final blow in the reorganization of the Republican Party into a populist party willing to support an autocratic leader. And this is imperiling our democracy in the 21st century. As I say, there's a formal moment when a constitutional crisis breaks out, when the president refuses to do what a federal court tells him his administration has to do. I'm not sure we have actually crossed the trigger wire yet, but it certainly looks like we're headed in that direction. And frankly, if we don't get there, it may be because Congress and the Supreme Court surrender their understanding of the constitutional order or relinquish fidelity to it, and endorse an alternative principle that gives us much less, as far as I'm concerned, safety. Now, I'm just going to point out very quickly one indication that we have lost a constitutional consensus is that Donald Trump remains reasonably favorably regarded, reasonably approved of. Please note I've moved over. I don't know if you've seen, but 538 is now being dismantled by ABC Disney. And so I've moved over to the Silver Bulletin to get us the most recent averages here, right? And Donald Trump has an approval rating that is essentially tied with his disapproval rating. By the way, one of the things that is coming out in the data again is that people very strongly approve or very strongly disapprove of President Trump. He's not just a polarizing figure, but he brings out the strongest of political emotions. And so I suspect that we're going to see his disapproval rating go up, especially if some of the financial fragility that seems to be triggered by the unpredictability of tariffs and other aspects of the Trump trade and economic policy that are slowly coming into focus, that his disapproval rating will probably go up. But it's not probably going to go up to the point where it becomes clear that there is a consensus rejecting Donald Trump's politics. So, with all of that in the background, again, a reminder of the idea that the Constitution relies on the constitutive power of the people, right? The Constitution is made in our name. We, the people of the United States of America, right, are the people who are the ultimate sovereign power that undergirds the constitutional order and that gives us a kind of ultimate interpretive authority over that Constitution. And having said that, that then raises the question, what can we do when the government appears to be violating what we understand our Constitution to mean? And that we can be a more or less extensive we, right? The we can be a we that includes the majority or a stable super majority of the people, and then hopefully over time through elections and through other ways of expressing our understanding of what the Constitution requires, we can bring the government to heel. But in a circumstance in which the people is more fractured, more right partitioned, equally divided, and some believe and some don't believe that the Constitution is being violated by the government. Things get much messier, much more difficult. I've suggested, right, some of the values that the Constitution serves as a way to understand both the concept of a constitutional crisis and of a constitutional consensus. The definition of powers and functions and limits of the main branches makes clear to us what we have authorized our government to do and what we haven't authorized our government to do. And again, right, the idea that we haven't authorized our government to persecute or vindictively punish journalists who report critically on it, that we haven't authorized them to take away the livelihood of lawyers just because they don't like what the lawyers are doing professionally. We could keep going, right? But I think that there's some sense that part of the reason we value the creation of a stable constitutional order is because it tells us there's certain things that the government cannot do, not only because the law doesn't permit them or the Constitution doesn't permit it to do those things, but also because a shared understanding of the limits of the legitimacy of governmental power protects us against its abuse. Similarly, the mechanism of checks and balances, the Madisonian or Montesquieuian architecture of the Constitution, is designed to not just force us to rely on the good character and values of our leaders, but to mobilize their ambition, their desire for power against each other, right? To recognize that we're not always going to be so lucky as to have genuinely principled leaders. And when we don't, or when, right, the possession of power tempts them or corrupts them, as it often does, then there are other institutions that will counteract them and prevent them from abusing their power and us as a result. Finally, the rule of law and the protection of rights, right? This is one of the things that Jefferson and Madison really disliked about the initial Constitution. It didn't have a Bill of Rights. James Madison drafted one for us based in part on what Jefferson had done in Virginia. And this creates a kind of security because there are certain core inviolable areas of freedom and autonomy, certain things the government can't interfere with. It can't persecute me on the basis of my religious belief or my political convictions, so long as I don't violate any law on that basis. I'm entitled to express my opinion, to express my ideas, to associate with whom I want, to believe what I want to believe. And this, again, I think is something that we should be deeply worried about. The way in which power is being used by this administration indicates that they don't value freedom of expression, the First Amendment. And frankly, I'm not sure that they value freedom of religion for religious minorities either. The constitutions or constitutions do not interpret or sustain themselves. They depend on the people in positions of power, but also ordinary people understanding and upholding their values. The degree to which we have a shared understanding varies over time. It can be more extensive or more contracted, more deeply connected to our essential principles, or more pragmatic. And so that leads us to recognize, right, the constitutional consensus evolves. It doesn't stay fixed. Um, and the ideas then having to do with a crisis when a constitutional consensus is eroded starts from the idea that we no longer have a shared understanding of the values, the ideals, the reasons to adhere by constitutional limits. And this may give rise to conflicting interpretations of what the Constitution allows and doesn't allow the government to do, what its normative prerequisites are. Sometimes those crises will be played out in an interinstitutional form. The president wants to do one thing, the Supreme Court wants to say that that is not allowed under the reigning interpretation of the Constitution. Who is going to prevail? And as we've seen, right, with Lincoln and FDR, sometimes the president and the Congress prevails in getting the Supreme Court to accept an alternative understanding of the Constitution as authorized and supported by the people in whose name the Constitution is created. Sometimes there's a long period of impasse. We saw that with FDR for nearly a decade, in which Congress and the president are passing laws and the Supreme Court is knocking them down. We are on the brink of a constitutional crisis at that point because the different branches of government are operating from different understandings of what the Constitution permits or requires. But please note ultimately that FDR and Congress obeyed the Constitution. This was not an Andrew Jackson or Richard Nixon moment where the president said, you know, I'm not going to follow what the courts tell me to do. And The deeper threshold for constitutional crisis then is when you get to the Jackson Nixon moment where the president is essentially saying, I'm above the law, or I don't need to adhere by these decisions because these institutions lack the power to force me to adhere. We have sectional crises where one region of the country has a different interpretation from another region of the country. And obviously, the Civil War is a key illustration of this. But I think if we look at a map of the United States today, that standard blue red map, we can see it's not as neat, it's not as clean, it's not as clearly drawn. But in the second quarter of the 21st century, we do seem to have increasing regional polarization as well as then partisan polarization. And partisan polarization occurs when different parties adhere to fundamentally different understandings of the Constitution. This was the case of the Republican Party in the build up to the Civil War. It was the case between Democrats and Republicans in the aftermath of the Civil War and the period of radical Reconstruction. It then subsided in the way that Levitsky and Zablat suggest, in part because both parties accepted the presence of the Dixiecrats within the Democratic Party, that is to say, racist, segregationist, disenfranchising, one party tyranny over the southern states, and then whitewashed it, right? Allowed those representatives to be chairs in the Senate and the House as if they were just normally elected officials. That in a sense masked the crisis of the differing understandings of race. It came back to the fore in the late 20th century with the civil rights revolution. Crises that stem from partitioned popular constitutional views. And this is the crisis that I think is perhaps the deepest crisis that we're suffering from in the middle of the 21st century. It's a crisis where basically roughly similar proportions of the population think that what Donald Trump is doing is perfectly fine and what they voted for him to do, and on the other hand, think that what he is doing is illegal, unconstitutional, criminal, abusive, and probably deserves impeachment, right? And so we are completely and utterly divided in our understandings of what the Constitution allows, as not just right members of parties or regions or within the institutions of government, but the people as a whole. And I think that creates a deeper problem for us. Um, Give me 1 second. I'm just going to mute everyone because there's a little bit of background sound. And as always, feel free to unmute yourself whenever you want. The final kind of crisis, I'll just go back to John Locke here for a moment, institutional usurpation crises, right? One or several branches of the government refuse to abide by and maintain the constitutional structure and rights, or one or several branches of the government refuse to recognize the stable majorities of the people's reasonable interpretation of constitutional values, right? And so B, right, that's the FDR case where the Supreme Court says we're going to stick with our old interpretation. A, right, the idea that the president is claiming powers that the Constitution does not give him is very similar, it seems to me, to what we're encountering in the 21st century. With all of this in mind, I'll then go back to a diagram we've looked at many times together before. This is the most recent version of it. I have here, right, Benjamin Page and Martin Gillen's famous diagram from Democracy in America ? Showing that average citizens have no impact on the likelihood of legislation being passed by their representatives when that legislation conflicts with the preferences of economic elites or organized interest groups, right? Organized interest groups and economic elites, the government responds to them in the way it's supposed to respond to average citizens. That is to say, when their support for policy increases, for policy change increases, the likelihood that policy is going to change increases. And when average citizens support for policy increases and it conflicts with what economic elites or interest groups want, it makes no difference to the likelihood of legislation being passed. And I want to suggest to you, right, this is at the base of a crisis that we're having in the 21st century, not a constitutional crisis, but an economic and social crisis, a crisis of spreading precariousness, of growing resentment, of the unfairness of the distribution of income, wealth, and opportunity in our society, and the failure of government to do anything about this. And so one sign of this, right, is in this distribution of wealth. The top 1% of the population has about a third of the wealth, right? And obviously, we see this when you put Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and the CEO of Google together. Those four men have as much wealth as roughly 50% of the American population. The bottom 50%, by the way, has only 2% of the wealth, right? And so the idea that our government has done nothing to address a crisis of spreading downward mobility, of eroding middle class standing, and then the felt injury of believing that you have lost status and standing in your society, and the governing elite does nothing about it. And by the way, Donald Trump is more responsive in certain respects. This is the conclusion of Page and Gillens, who give us this diagram, in certain respects to popular views, anti-immigrant views, for instance, than have been previous democratic elites. If you give up on the idea that your government is really going to do anything about economic inequality, about social mobility, about access to education, at least, damn it, respond to us on some of the stuff we believe. We're distressed by the level of migration to the country. We think it's unfair. We think it's too fast. We think it's eroding our sense of cohesiveness. We think that it's straining our municipal resources. Donald Trump will do something about that. He at least is responsive in certain ways. And so again, that there is a base to this sense that the Constitution is not working the way it's supposed to work, and that the channels of accountability that make us a democratic society are so hardened, are so non-responsive in the 21st century, that it may make sense to rethink whether or not we actually value this constitutional structure. By the way, if you look at the amount spent on the 2024 presidential campaign, you see this ongoing creeping oligarchization of American government. And I just think, right, this is part and parcel of the problem. So where are the Democrats, right? We've talked about the fact that Congress is controlled by the Republican Party, and that therefore we shouldn't expect there to be much of a pushback if Donald Trump abuses power from the Republicans in Congress. But what about the Democrats, right? And I think we've seen this Tuesday night's congressional address. The Democrats didn't really have a unified strategy. They don't know how to react. And I'm going to suggest to you a way of thinking about why the Democrats may seem to be especially powerless in the 21st century. And so I'm building on the scholarship of Daniel Schlossman and his co-author Sam Rosenfeld, and their Schlossman's book when movements anchor parties, I think helps give us a sense of when the Democratic Party was strong, how it was rooted in organized labor in particular, right? That's the movement that anchored the Democratic Party in the middle of the 20th century, and that with the decline of organized labor, but more broadly speaking, with the decline of uh, social movements that have broad-based membership and that can actually mobilize their leaders, our political parties have become unanchored in civil society. They are hollowed out. They're vehicles for leaders and donors to organize the campaign of charismatic individuals. They're not mechanisms for connecting ordinary grassroots individuals to a political movement that empowers them. And so the Democratic Party isn't just struggling to come up with the right strategy. It's not a question just of, well, how oppositional should we be? Should we, stand up against everything Trump does, or should we pick our fights? How loud and disobedient should we be in the way in which we protest, right? Those are strategic questions that take for granted the current level of power of the Democratic Party. My suggestion to you is what's really revealed by the spinning of the wheels of the Democrats is the lack of capacity and power that they have, right? So movements no longer anchor the party. The party no longer has an independent basis in civil society. They no longer have mechanisms for mobilizing voters independently from large donors, and therefore they're dependent upon large donors. And that means that they are extremely reluctant to do things that large donors don't want them to do. And that means that they don't upend the boat when the boat is distributing income in a terribly unequal and unfair way. This is a sign, again, of the weakness of the Democratic Party. And I want to suggest, right, that the Make America Great Again movement, the Tea Party movement that preceded it, these are more astroturf movements, right? That they're mobilized by rich donors, but they're rich donors who are not just trying to buy advertising time or social media influencing time or to run campaigns. They're actually trying to mobilize people in civil society to come to rallies, to come to protests, to do get out the vote. It's not the same as a fully spontaneous bottom-up grassroots organization, but it has some of the power to anchor the political movement. The Democrats lack this. And so the last thing I'll say to you today, I know I've used up my time. Last thing I'll say, and then I don't get there. Sorry, I'll bypass this for now. I was going to show you that neither party is particularly approved of, but what I really want to speak to for the coming week is how in the past, right, in the middle of the 20th century, Democrats and the people who supported them built civic power, built people's power by organizing in unions and social movements and other solidarity building organizations. How some of this has been actually done in the early 21st century, for instance, by migrants' rights organizations, but how it needs to be done again, right? If the Democratic Party is going to rebuild its roots in civil society, it needs to be met halfway by organizations in civil society that actually integrate and mobilize people, right? And so that's where we need to go and beginning to think about countervailing power, how to resist the Trump administration when it abuses power. We need to be better organized at the grassroots, at the civil society level. It's not enough to write checks. It's not enough to sign petitions. It's not enough to go to an occasional rally. We need organizations rooted in local communities that have strategic capacity. And so that's where we'll start. And then we are going to need to couple that conversation with the question, how do we also reach out to people we disagree with in order to rebuild constitutional consensus? This is hard work. This is not winning a lawsuit. This is not winning a special election in Florida. This is the kind of work that frankly took the progressive movement in the United States 50 years. And I think we need to recognize in the 21st century, if we're going to restore democracy in America, we need to be in it for the long haul. It's going to be slow, hard work, but it's work that we've succeeded in the past and can succeed in again if we put our shoulders to it. All right, I will stop there for today. I hope you guys will have questions, thoughts, comments, suggestions. Who wants to start us out? And please go ahead. It looks like you're unmuted.
Okay. Um, so just with reference to the magnificent speech the other night, is among all of the lies that Trump found to spew, I just came spotted right away. He talked, one of the things he was so proud of, he talked about our accomplishments and the build, the bridges and the railroads. And who built them? Didn't mention that. That's all. It was just
Yeah, yeah.
that
I
one
mean,
really
and
caught my eye, caught my ear, and it's been bugging me terribly.
thank thank you, Anne. And I'll be really quick about this. It's not just taking credit for infrastructure that was built by previous presidents, right, or by previous Congresses, or by previous combined efforts. It's also claiming that the economy was a wreck when he took office, right? When in fact it was probably the strongest economy in the world. Yes, Donald Trump is pushing the limits of a post-truth presidency. And again, I think we're so partitioned, right? Roughly 30 to 40% of us live in the Fox News universe, on the Fox News diet, as they say, right? Nothing but Fox News. And for those people, what Donald Trump said on Tuesday night was accurate and verifiable, right? For the remaining 60%, well, roughly half of us recognize it when he's spouting lies, which is so much of the time, right? But then what about the other, right, roughly third of American society? People who are frankly disengaged, who don't pay a lot of attention to politics, who are busy doing other things or have maybe even better things to think about. People for whom the news finds them on their social media feeds as opposed to them going out and trying to get the news. And how can we reach the other third of Americans who may be amenable to persuasion that, wait a sec, Donald Trump is not telling you the full story here, and you need to understand how we got this done. And so again, I do think that working in ways that bring us in touch with people that we don't necessarily agree with, even if they don't fully constitute our political rivals, is going to be extremely important in the coming 4 years, but probably the coming 50 years as well. Flossie, it looks to me like you're getting ready to unmute. Is that right? You're not quite there yet. Thank you for the good question, Anne, by the way. I think if you hold your space bar down, Flossie. Still muted. There we go. You got it.
What I'm confused now, I'm not confused about it, I see it. Trump is playing a game with Musk. He's They're his puppets in a way. Uh, he sets out a policy. We seem to be accepting it, or we're uncertain. And then he withdraws because there is some communication from the public. Then, when we seem to be making an attempt at getting something straightened out, um, Musk steps in and says, no, we can't do that. His job, I think, is manipulated by Trump, who has less intelligence and brains than he has. But he seems to be calling the shots. So I don't know where the real enemy is. Who is calling the shots? Trump seems to be the puppeteer, and he's got a couple of puppets. But yes, he's relying on Musk to test what he can get away with. That's my interpretation.
Yeah, and I think that sounds like a pretty good interpretation, Flossie. I do think that one of the things that is important to recognize is that this administration and this president rely on and flourish in conditions of chaos, right? And so that actually having multiple and contradictory centers of power within the same administration may be one of its MOs, right? The contradictions actually serve to create the chaos, and that puts your opposition on its back foot. They don't know which of the various things that you appear to be doing you're actually doing. And it puts someone who is not restricted by normal moral or normative considerations in an advantageous position. They have greater latitude for action, and the chaos and confusion allows them to take advantage of it. So having said all of that, I'll say just a little bit more, which is I think if you want to try to detect the deeper logic underneath the chaos, because there's an awful lot of chaos, right? But if you want to really see where the action that is, I think, most significant, most important to the Trump administration, most threatening to its critics, is occurring, you've got to go someplace like Project 2025. You've got to look at the playbook. You've got to recognize that there are not just Donald Trump and Elon Musk, but thousands of people who are playing critical roles within this administration who have been preparing for several years for a second and more radical Trump presidency, right? And so the assault on the environment, the effort to dismantle the EPA's ability to control for climate change, I think that's really central to a lot of what's going on here. The assault on deportation, I'm sorry, on immigration and the effort to deport people, which is not actually going that well. But nevertheless, I think it's a central uh, goal of this administration. The effort to really diminish the capacity of the entire administrative state to regulate our economy in the name of consumer safety, in the name of economic order, in the name of environmental safety. Again, I think that's a central goal. Those are the goals that are well funded, that the deep pockets who supported Donald Trump care most about. And that in a sense, part of the work that all the chaos coming out of Elon Musk does is to cover up, to not let us discern clearly, wait, this is what they're really trying to do. So yes, there was a blow up in the White House, I guess, at the end of the week last week, where Musk and Rubio really went head to head, and Trump, in a sense, is perhaps restraining Musk a little bit. Musk is another chaos engine, and I don't know, frankly, if he's smarter than Donald Trump. I'm sure he's a better engineer. If you want somebody to build a good electric car or a rocket or a satellite system, of course you choose Elon Musk. But if you want somebody to bring about governmental reform, I think both of them are extremely limited in their understanding of how government operates. I think it may be that Donald Trump has a little bit better of an understanding in a Manichaean way of how power works, right? And that he may be starting to rein in Elon Musk a little bit, precisely because he doesn't want Elon Musk to undermine his power, Trump's power. All right, Flossie, thank you. Good effort to focus on who's the real protagonist here. Anybody else with a question or a thought for today? All right, so we will pick up right where we left off this week, next week. I hope you have good weeks. I hope everyone will be well. It's fun as always spending a little bit of Saturday with you guys. Serious stuff that we're talking about. We will continue the conversation, and I hope begin to outline some of the ways in which we can think about responding constructively to the crisis in American politics. Thank you. Be well. See everybody next week. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dave.